morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Hi, just a brief introduction. My name is Angie Atkinson. I'm one of the supervisory park rangers here at Gettysburg. And I want to welcome everyone to the 2022 annual Sacred Trust Talks presented by the Gettysburg Foundation and Gettysburg National Military Park. We are pleased to collaborate with the Gettysburg Foundation to invite renowned Civil War historians, authors, National Park Service rangers, licensed battlefield guides, and experts to participate in Sacred Trust to share their unique perspectives with our visitors. Our next speaker, Dr. Diane Miller Sommerville, will address the challenges historians face when attempting to explore causes of war trauma, a phenomenon that was not yet known or recognized in the 19th century. Despite this, abundant records from the era, asylum patient histories, newspaper accounts, service records, and coroners' reports make abundantly clear that psychic injuries afflicted many Civil War soldiers, hindering readjustment to civilian and family life. Dr. Diane Miller Sommerville is a professor of history at Binghamton University in upstate New York. Dr. Sommerville specializes in 19th century Southern history, notably issues of gender, race, sexuality, and medicine, and teaches courses on the Civil War, early U.S. women's history, history of the South and sex in American history, among other topics. She is the author of 2 monographs, Rape and Race in the 19th Century South, and Aberration of Mind, Suicide and Suffering in the Civil War Era South, a Lincoln Prize finalist and winner of the Willie Lee Rose Prize for Best Book on Southern History by a Brain. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Diane Miller Sommerville.
You can thank the technical gods for allowing us to be in this air conditioning space, which is, I think, a real godsend. Thank you for coming out today, and thank you to Wayne for inviting me wherever he is. He's probably in the back, like Wizard of Oz, pulling some strings. I was telling Wayne earlier today that I've come here, done a CWI. But I had only done one tour of the battlefield, and I wanted to spend some time on the battlefield later today. And I was blessed with being given a tour in the mid to late 90s by none other than Jim McPherson. You may know him, right? So I was what's called a preceptor for him at Princeton University, and a friend of mine and I convinced him to do a tour for the students, and so we all came up here, and I brought my 2 children who were probably like 5 and 10, somewhere around there. And Jim has, he's done this so many times. He's organized. He knew exactly where to go, when to go. We'll meet here at the tower, and then we're going to have lunch at McDonald's, and we're going to finish at Pickett's Charge. So my children are doing all this, walking all over campus, and so we get to the last leg, which is, of course, crossing in Pickett's Charge and the field, and they took one look at it and said, no. Wish that some of Pickett's men would have said that. Anyway, so I'm going to start. Today what I'm going to do is talk about something that really has only come to fore among historians relatively recently, essentially war trauma. We all kind of shorthand war trauma to PTSD, but I want to make clear that PTSD is a very specific diagnosis with very specific criteria. And so when I use that term, I'm kind of giving in a little bit to that popular use of that term, but I do recognize that it's a very specific diagnosis. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and I'm also going to work in some of the reasons that historians are late coming to trauma and the Civil War, and I'm going to intersperse some generalizations, maybe a little bit of statistics, and then I want to introduce some of the soldiers who experience some of these symptoms, and so that you know that this is affecting real men and their families. So everyone is familiar with the term shell shock. Let's see if this works. There we go. It emerged during World War I to explain aberrational, emotional, psychological neurological behavior in soldiers. This was the first time that doctors diagnosed war-induced psychological trauma in American soldiers. And they believed that this was the first time psychiatric ailments could be attributed to military experiences. And they reasoned that the horrific nature of warfare in World War I, poisonous gases, trench warfare, effectively modern weaponry, was what triggered this new and severe psychological reaction in World War I soldiers. But they were wrong. They were wrong to believe that World War I soldiers and veterans were the first to experience psychological damage from warfare. Historians have studied the effects of war trauma on soldiers, but until recently, rarely on those who fought in the Civil War. Both world wars have yielded studies of war trauma: World War I, shell shock; World War II, battle fatigue. The diagnosis of PTSD actually emerged in the wake of Vietnam veterans returning home. And of course, the most recent wars in the Middle East have put PTSD in the news and center stage in films and books. This modern bias in the study of war trauma is all the more curious, since scholars who study war trauma, like Richard Gabriel, whom I quote on this slide, conclude that the war trauma is an inescapable part of war. It is ubiquitous. Well, why then not the Civil War? I've identified essentially three reasons that I think this is the case. And the first of these, of course, is that PTSD was not recognized or understood at the time because it did not exist as a medical condition until the Civil War. Now, there were vague umbrella terms used at the time that might be viewed as recognition of mental illnesses that could be tied to soldiering. Soldier's heart, nostalgia are the ones that come to mind. Melancholia and the Blue Devils signaled depression. A soldier with a case of the nerves was probably suffering from anxiety. Soldier's heart might well have been what we think of as panic attacks, and so on. But importantly, the medical profession in the 19th century lacked the scientific understanding that a traumatic experience like warfare could harm the mind, not the brain. So they had no words to identify PTSD or shell shock as medical caregivers in the later wars did. Remember, this is several decades before Freud. They had no understanding that a symptom like a startle response to a loud noise, a reflexive action of fright conditioned by the sounds of battle, could be triggered by combat. Because these causation links between battle experiences and psychiatric distress eluded doctors, we cannot find explicit evidence of war-generated trauma in the historical records. Even when soldiers and veterans entered insane asylums, and they did, suffering from what we would recognize as classic symptoms of psychic reactions to battle, possibly PTSD, medical caregivers just couldn't see it. Instead, they blamed heredity, sunstroke, alcoholism, even masturbation. As a result, historians will look in vain for any discussion or recordings of anything we might consider to be war trauma, even in patients' medical records, which has made the study of PTSD and Civil War soldiering more challenging. When Civil War soldiers and doctors themselves didn't see a connection between war and mental breakdowns and left little direct evidence about psychological injuries, how could historians, working over 100 years later and applying modern terms and diagnoses, confidently conclude that Civil War soldiers suffered from the effects of war trauma? Now, this is a good place to stop and clarify that historians studying trauma in the Civil War are not trying to diagnose these historical subjects. We lack the medical training and expertise, as well as the detailed records like questionnaires that a proper diagnosis requires. The best we can do is observe that Civil War soldiers exhibited symptoms that today would be suggestive of war-related trauma disorders like PTSD. The second reason Civil War has escaped the attention of scholars studying psychiatry in the military is that there is an assumption that modern wars conducted with more lethal technologies, literally weapons of mass destruction, lethal gases, airplanes, tanks, took a far greater toll on 20th century soldiers, stoking fear and anxiety among World War I and World War II soldiers and contributing to the mental breakdowns of many. Scholars like Richard Gabriel imply that the Civil War was quaint, employing pre-modern tactics and weaponry that proved less frightening, less lethal to its warriors. And I know that there are some of you who are thinking that's just not true. In the absence of weapons of mass destruction, the reasoning goes, the Civil War soldiers had little reason to experience mental collapse. The most striking claim of uniquely horrific military experiences, of course, came in the avalanche of popular and academic literature that painted the Vietnam veteran as exceptional in the unprecedented levels of psychological suffering he experienced. Some scholars pointed to the unparalleled killing of civilians by U.S. soldiers, think My Lai, exposure to Agent Orange, heroin addiction, the ferocity of the Viet Cong, and finally to the hostile reception that Vietnam veterans received at home, to argue for the singularity of extensive psychiatric casualties that plagued survivors of the Vietnam War. And I want to point to a book, if you're not familiar with it, it's an older book now, but it was really important at the time it came out, was Eric Dean's 1997 Shook Over Hell. He challenged this characterization of the Vietnam's war experience as singular and was the first really to counter that claim with examples from the Civil War soldiers who suffered trauma. So those of us who do study it today owe a lot to Eric Dean's pathbreaking work. Civil War soldiers faced none of these aspects of modern war, so the reasoning went, so had fewer reasons to suffer psychological collapse. But this claim overlooks other factors that were unique to the Civil War that could prove just as traumatic for 19th century soldiers as those in 20th century wars. Foremost, companies were formed locally, right? So company mates were likely to be relatives or neighbors from home that they had known for years. So when a soldier witnessed maybe a neighbor or brother horrifically being killed in front of him, it had a more personal impact than if it was a modern war when the company's mates began as total strangers. So that's just one way in which I think the Civil War had its own culturally grounded differences that made trauma very difficult. The final reason that I think it has taken historians a longer time to consider battle-related psychiatric casualties among Civil War soldiers is that, until relatively recently, the lion's share of Civil War history has focused on generals and battles, less so on the soldiers. Now, that's begun, and there's a few notable exceptions, but that's begun to change quite a lot in the last 2 decades. The triumphalist approach to history tended not to address the consequences of the generals' decisions and their battles, but that has changed too. There has been a shift of emphasis lately in much of the history that is being written about the Civil War. Historians, many of them now, are focusing on the gritty, dark underbelly of war. And that includes the study of war trauma that encompasses men who emerged from the Civil War permanently scarred mentally and who sometimes resorted to suicide. Recent works, including my own, marshal abundant evidence that suggests Civil War soldiers and veterans, like their 20th century counterparts, exhibited symptoms that today we would associate with war trauma, notably post-traumatic stress disorder. Focusing our attention on Civil War soldiers with the benefit of recent studies of war trauma and neurological impairment permits us to see that these men were greatly affected by combat experience. Even a cursory glimpse of asylum records, diaries, and wartime newspapers reveals a virtual epidemic of emotional and psychiatric trauma among Civil War soldiers and veterans that manifested in a wide array of psychological symptoms. Institutionalization and even suicide occurred in the most extreme examples. So I'm going to start with trying briefly to talk a little bit about how the psychologists who study PTSD, how have they defined it? And again, you're going to find multiple definitions, but I think these two are probably the most concise, and I think most of us can relate to how they define it. Rachel Yehuda defines the core traumatic event of PTSD as one that has the capacity to provoke fear, helplessness, or horror in response to the threat of injury or death. Symptoms include major depression, panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and substance abuse. Another expert on PTSD Aaron Finley builds on Yehuda's definition by identifying 3 additional categories of symptoms. 1, re-experiencing the event, in other words, being haunted by memories of the traumatic event, like through nightmares or flashbacks. Avoidance of reminders of the events. So this could manifest itself in emotional distancing and social isolation. And finally, hyperarousal or a heightened responsiveness to one's environment, which can manifest as insomnia, irritability, impaired concentration, and increased startle reaction. Civil War soldiers did indeed exhibit a variety of symptoms like those that today are readily associated with combat stress: despondency and detachment, anxiety, sleeplessness, mania, violent behavior, irritability, delusions and paranoia, hypervigilance and depression. I found all of these examples in my study of Civil War soldiers and veterans. These combat-related symptoms, in turn, contributed to social pathologies like domestic turmoil, an uptick in violence, alcoholism and drug abuse, and incarceration. In severe cases, Civil War veterans afflicted with psychological distress ended up in asylums and/or engaged in suicidal behavior. This morning, I will describe some of those psychological challenges that Civil War soldiers faced, clear evidence that they suffered from war-related trauma disorders. Now, my book is on the South. It's on Confederate soldiers and veterans, and actually the civilian home front as well, and the enslaved and the formerly enslaved. But Dylan Carroll has a new book out called Invisible Wounds that looks at the North and the South and finds many of the things that I found in my own research are also true of Northern soldiers. So that's no surprise to me. And the first thing I want to talk about is violence. PTSD is associated with an increased risk of violence. Anger, depression, irritability are symptoms that sometimes elevate to physical violence or aggression. And because many who suffer from war-induced trauma take to alcohol or drugs, that violence can also be connected to substance abuse. You often see the two very much connected. There is evidence that Civil War veterans engaged in violent behavior, and the first to document this was Eric Dean in his book, Shook Over Hell. He found high rates of violence among Indiana veterans who were patients in an insane asylum. So he has this sample of 291 veterans, and he uses them to draw some conclusions about their characteristics while inpatient. Over 40% of his sample had attempted or committed acts of violence, and over 20% threatened violence. It's unsurprising that family members would be among the most obvious victims. In Dean's study, over 1/4 of the assaults were on family members. Now, my study, I have a much smaller pool that I can draw from. I'm looking at veterans who were institutionalized in Georgia at the State Lunatic Asylum in Milledgeville. So it's smaller than his, but it also presents very high rates of incidence of violence, in fact, much higher than Dean's sample. Overwhelmingly, Southern veterans in asylums presented with histories of violence, usually committed against family members and sometimes themselves. So of the 33 inmates that I've identified, and I will say that one of the other challenges to historians is you and I would assume that part of an intake form or interview would identify somebody who has had military experience or fought in a war. They did not. So you'll have a lot of these men as male patients that were of the age that they probably were fought in the war, but I had to then do an additional layer of work, which is going to fold 3 to see if they showed up, and Lord forbid if it was a name like William Smith or Joe Miller, it was really difficult. So I had to not include a lot of men who I suspect were veterans because I couldn't validate that they were in fact veterans. So as you can see, about 75% of these were identified as violent or very violent. And so here's some individual stories of veteran soldiers who were quite violent. Witness the story of Alabama and William Jones, who first showed signs of derangement a few months after the war ended. Prior to his discharge in April, Jones had been confined at Camp Chase in Ohio. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more more deeply about POWs, survivors, because they, more than anyone else, show up with having the most extreme cases of I think, war-related symptoms. So while at Camp Chase, he was quite physiologically ill. He suffered, like a lot of soldiers in the Civil War, from chronic diarrhea, which of course you know can be very debilitating, and many, many soldiers died from this. But when he returned home, his family reported that his mind was much disordered. To his credit, Jones nonetheless persevered, put in a good crop that fall, but less than a year later, he began exhibiting menacing behavior, threatening the life of his father, among others. He also threatened arson and endangered his own life by jumping into a well, which in my study I find is an incredibly common form of suicide, intentional suicide. Asylum officials noted that while Jones had been a masturbator and used tobacco in the past, both which are commonly in the 19th century associated with insanity in males, it was believed that he had abandoned both, implying that they were scratching their heads. They were not sure. If you can eliminate those and there was no evidence of heredity, what is causing him? And like you and I are like, oh, let's look to his military service, right? But they did not. Another example, after repeated attempts on his father's life, James Payne from Georgia was institutionalized. Actually, he was sent home from the Army in 1863 because his mind became affected. In time, his behavior grew worse. He became uncontrollable. Payne's family, like families of other psychologically disturbed veterans, had to be placed in a local jail to contain him. This was a very common form of restraint with somebody who was mentally ill, men or women, black or white. If a family could no longer keep that person from harming family members or neighbors, they would be just put into the local jail. And 4 years later, he was in there for years, and they finally put him into an asylum in Georgia. Or take the case of Confederate veteran William James, who first showed signs of derangement shortly after the war's end. He was held captive in a northern POW camp, another POW survivor. He had emerged physically ill, and his mind was much disordered. An Alabama farmer, he tried to restart his old life by putting a crop in 1865, but within a year he had become uncontrollably violent. He threatened to kill his father and endangered his own life by jumping in a well in a failed attempt to kill himself. Post-war lunatic asylums records are filled with veterans whose uncontrollable rage jeopardized their lives and those of family members. Like Neil's Story. Story was just a teen when he enlisted in the 46th Infantry. So this is a sample of what I encountered looking at the Georgia Asylum admission book. And this was, as you can see, there's not a whole lot of information here, but I've transcribed it so you can see what they took. And this is one case where they did use the war as kind of a watershed. He has been suspected of insanity only since July last. So, and it talks about being in the Army. So this is one of the few cases where there is a discussion of the war. And you can see he exhibited peculiar behavior during the war, and when he returned home, he was, quote, wanting in his former energy and activity. Still, he tried to reintegrate into civilian life as a farmer, but by 1872, and note this is years after the end of the war, he had grown uncontrollably violent. He threatened to kill family members and to burn down the house. Desperate, his family built a small log cabin expressly to confine him, and finally they resorted to institutionalizing him in the Georgia Asylum in Milledgeville, where caregivers noted he ate and slept erratically, was listless and disinclined to move or talk. And as we all know, veterans of late wars, and are oftentimes disinclined to talk about their experiences, at least for a while. So that shouldn't surprise us. Violence directed to the self, suicidal behavior, is another indicator of PTSD and occurs at a higher rate among veterans than civilians. In one study of Vietnam veterans suffering from PTSD, 1/5, or 20% of the cohort, had made suicidal attempts, and another fifth were preoccupied with suicidal thoughts. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any quantitative data to track suicide among Civil War veterans, but the Georgia asylum patients, that cohort of 33 patients that I identified who were veterans, about 1/3 of those were suicidal, which is to say that either the families of these veterans communicated that to the medical superintendent, or while in the asylum they demonstrated either attempts or suicidal wishes. One of those was Albinus Snelson, a Georgia native who served in the Confederate cavalry. His post-war life exemplifies a common kind of recovery and relapse cycle peppered with multiple suicide attempts. Like Neil's story, Snelson was just a teen when he enlisted. He struggled while a soldier and, in fact, was discharged early and entered the Georgia asylum, where he attempted to burn himself and throw himself out of windows in efforts to kill himself. And he finally succeeded in 1871 when he ingested strychnine. William Davis, also a former Confederate cavalryman, took his life after years of sharing suicidal intentions with those around him. In 1872, Davis tied a string around his foot, attached it to the trigger of a double-barrel shotgun, and shot himself in the head. In August of 1866, just a little over a year later, after the war ended, 35-year-old Edward Weeks from Petersburg, Virginia, approached his 11-year-old son, kissed him, and told him goodbye, explaining that he would not be with him another night. That evening, Weeks' wife, his second, whom he had just married a year before, witnessed him taking morphine pills. As soon as her husband fell asleep, she sent for the physicians, who failed to save him, and he succumbed to an overdose. Then there is the case of a 38-year-old Irish grocer from Lynchburg, Virginia, who cryptically hinted to his friends that his suicidal impulse emanated from his experience in battle, in combat. So this is one of those unusual cases where the soldier is making the connection that nobody around him is, right? And he apparently witnessed somebody nearby him, one of his company mates, who was shot through with a cannonball. And he would tell people that he wanted to die that same way. And we can speculate that maybe there's some survivor's guilt going on here too, right? Especially if he was really close to him, and as fate would have it, he was spared, but his company mate was not. Shannon got his wish, sort of, as he shot himself in the head with a 5-shooter. Now, I want to take one moment to just talk about newspapers as sources. You'll see that this is a very brief, one-sentence reporting of his suicide. But newspapers in the 19th century were not reticent about reporting on suicides or including it in obituaries, unlike today, right? So if you know somebody who took their own lives and you read the obituary, it almost never says that it was self-inflicted. It's an unexpected death. And so for people like me or anybody researching suicide in the 19th century, newspapers are really great sources. Some of them are actually quite sensationalized. I begin my first chapter with a book about somebody who kills himself in a Richmond hotel, and the reporting gives all the gory details about the blood coming under the hotel door. So some of them clearly were trying to sensationalize to sell newspapers as well. This one is just very straightforward reporting. And on the right is coroners reports, which is another source of good primary sources on suicides. And this one, the coroner convenes a board and they interview witnesses, and you can elicit from these reports, because the implied question is always why? What drove this person to suicide? And here you can say he spoke of some lieutenant or captain that was in his company that was shot through with a cannonball whilst in the army, and he wanted to die that way. So that also is a really great source for us, trying to document believed causes of these suicides. We also see in Civil War soldiers manifestations of delusions, another symptom of PTSD. Chronic fear, the fear of being killed, commonly plagues combat veterans, and it is associated with war-induced trauma. Civil War soldiers, like their later brothers in arms, also suffered from delusional paranoia, the kind associated with extreme cases of PTSD. Veteran John Williams was admitted to the Georgia asylum with what we would recognize as post-combat hypervigilance. He was constantly frightened. He complained that people were trying to kill him. In a state of extreme agitation, he cut his own throat. 40-year-old Joseph Pearman, a harness maker from Petersburg, Virginia, likewise took his own life in 1875 after protesting that someone was coming out from the city to kill him. Counterintuitive, but I think it speaks to the irrationality of these thoughts. While the circumstances of the Civil War might have been very different from 20th century wars, Civil War soldiers suffered the same fate as many in later wars. The historical record leaves no doubt that they contended with emotional and psychological fallout that appears to have been related to their military experience, whether or not they realized it. And much like modern veterans, they turned to alcoholism and drug use too during the Civil War and after. Today, alcohol and drug use by soldiers and veterans is understood as an attempt to self-medicate, to numb oneself to the trauma memories of warfare. But in the 19th century, substance abuse, especially alcohol, was viewed not as a symptom of mental illness, but as a cause of mental illness. Veterans who drank excessively were usually diagnosed by asylum caregivers as intemperate, which was then attributed as the cause of their insanity. And again, it's not looking back and seeing that their experience in battle drove them to the bottle. Rather, it was the bottle, right? So there's no further, once they identify that a man is a drinker, then that becomes the cause of his insanity. 19th century medical professionals looked no further than intemperance, widely regarded as a moral failing, and therefore did not consider that war-related conditions may have precipitated or aggravated alcoholism. Evidence that alcoholism emerged as a post-war psychological pathology is seen in a significant number of Southern asylum inmates admitted with extensive alcohol and drug abuse. And I will also mention that a perusal of Southern newspapers right after the war, and even a lot of the diaries of Southerners, comment on the uptick in drinking. And as we know, Southerners before the war were pretty well known for, they had a reputation for hearty drinking, right? So that had to have been a significant uptick for them to make that observation. For example, drinking, not a 2-year stint in the Confederate Army, explained veteran B.W. Johnson's unbalanced state of mind. Officials admitting the former soldier to the asylum attributed his erratic and violent behavior, including someone simply because he had the same name as the prophet Daniel, to drink. Admissions records describe Johnson's alcohol consumption as excessive. He drank a quart of whiskey at a clip. So I would say that assessment is probably spot on. Caregivers at the Georgia asylum also seemed oblivious to the service record of Hugh Lewis, though they conceded that when he returned after the war, his mind was somewhat affected. A recent, that is, post-war indulgence in liquor had made him excited and violent, followed by an apathetic condition in which he is indisposed to notice anything or speak very rarely. I also noticed that sometimes when, so those transcriptions into the asylum admissions book, the family members often will say, he never drank. He was a teetotaler until the war. And then he began drinking excessively. Now, a lot of people, especially the civilians, blame the Civil War for the soldiers coming home with a lot of bad habits. So I guess that's not all that unusual. Less common than alcoholism, but a real problem with thousands of soldiers returning home injured or chronically ill, was the abuse of or addiction to opiates. Opiates in its various forms, morphine, laudanum, was used extensively by treating physicians during the Civil War. It was among the most commonly used medicines. Doctors administered it for a wide range of medical conditions, including pain, diarrhea, fever, migraines, and to sedate patients. And while most of the doctors were aware of the risks of addiction, they really didn't have any other options. Consequently, opiate abuse plagued many soldiers in the Civil War, in the post-war years. And as I was telling Wayne before, a former PhD student of mine, Jonathan Jones, who's at VMI, will be publishing a study of this, what he calls the first opioid crisis, which is a study of opiate use by veterans and tracks their addiction and all of the problems that were attendant with that. Opiate abuse, of course, like alcoholism, attacks the body. This image is one example. It's an extreme example. This is not a veteran or a soldier. This is when the syringe became much more in use during this mid-19th century Civil War era. And this is an example. This appears in a medical journal submitted by a doctor who wanted to show an addict who had, his body was just riddled with holes from attempts to inject him with opiates. But it also, in addition to sapping their strength, it drained their bank accounts, it rendered many unable to work, it ruined marriages, it also killed. Sometimes inadvertently, at other times it became the means to intentionally commit suicide. And I should add that it's not always clear whether the veterans used the drug to kill themselves intentionally or whether it was an accidental overdose. Sometimes we just don't have the information to say one way or the other. Wounded veterans like A.G. Ewing sought relief from physical suffering through opium. For a decade, he had relied on opium to alleviate pain following the amputation of a leg in 1862, a reliance that led to addiction that eventually killed Ewing. He died of an overdose. Opium addiction landed Robert Brown, a 45-year-old farmer from South Carolina, in the asylum in that state in 1868. Substance and alcohol abuse also hindered veterans' ability to secure and maintain gainful employment after the war. The inability to hold a job jeopardized the veteran's ability to provide for his family, which initiated a cycle of depression and stress that often fueled marital and family discord, compounding the problems that veterans face. And obviously, too, it becomes expensive. And so while no one has looked in, I know that some people are working on incarceration and claims that a lot of the criminals after the Civil War were veterans. I'd be interested to know how many of them had become addicts and needed to steal in order to buy more opium. So John Jackson had been twice captured during the war, and he had lapsed into what was called a gloomy and a depressing melancholy after he had been fired from his railroad job in 1873 for intemperance. Addie Jackson, the deceased wife, recounted how her husband openly talked about suicide and questioned about which method of death would be easiest, and he opted for gunshot. I also note that in my study, I find that, as we know, alcohol is liquid courage, right? So a lot of veterans and soldiers, I think, ingested opium or alcohol to help them make that final decision to take their own lives. Studies of modern prisoners of war offer insights about the conditions of captivity that can help explain why Civil War POW survivors seem to have been at a very, very high risk for psychiatric debility. POW experiences have varied widely but share some common features. Their capture usually occurs on top of the experience of war trauma, so they return home victims of both battle trauma and captivity trauma. Many have undergone torture, humiliation, isolation, loss of freedom, extended periods of boredom and monotony, of course starvation, and were subjected to total control, causing severe traumatization and contributing to very high rates of PTSD-like symptoms for periods well past their release. Studies of former POWs from recent wars indicate high rates, anywhere from 46% to 90%, of lifetime PTSD, with nearly 1/3 meeting PTSD criteria 40 to 50 years after their release. A significant percentage, 37% of former 20th century POWs also suffer from alcohol abuse or dependence throughout their lives. Researchers conclude that captivity produces deep and abiding pathology, quite possibly because prisoners of war suffer the worst traumas experienced by humans. The pathologies attributed to modern POWs reflect the experiences of many Civil War participants that were held in prison camps. Freed Civil War prisoners returned home with both the physical and psychic manifestations of trauma and abuse. And I also find it interesting that, as I said, that caregivers, family members, even soldiers and veterans didn't get the connection between their service and their symptoms, right? But the one time where there was plenty of recognition that a wartime experience was probably to blame for these symptoms was when they were POWs. And I think it has something to do with the fact that they could then blame the enemy, right? It's not an individual failing. It's not because their country drafted them and put them out there. It was blame it on those Yankees, right? I think that must have had something to do with it. For example, when POW Tom Furcher was deposited at the Columbia Asylum after the war, attendants described his mental illness to, quote, the effects of imprisonment. Daniel Mullins also entered the South Carolina Asylum shortly after the war, suffering from insanity due to, quote, long commitment in one of the northern prisons. Iverson Holt, only 19 when he was admitted to the Georgia Asylum in 1866. At 15, he had enlisted in Gordon's brigade, was captured at Gettysburg, and imprisoned for about 6 months. He returned to duty and was wounded late in the war. Holt survived and obtained a railroad job after the war, but for no obvious reasons, he left that job, wandered about aimlessly, and became excitable, noisy, and disposed to strip himself in public. Union forces twice captured Frank Kluel, a North Carolina native, an officer in the Missouri Cavalry Unit, first near Vicksburg in 1863, and he was held at Johnson's Island for 19 months before being exchanged for a Union officer, but then was recaptured a second time in early 1865 and detained at Ship Island in the Gulf of Mexico until the end of the war. After his relief, Kluel ended up in St. Louis, where he killed himself in April 1867 by taking an overdose of morphine. The last a symptom I want to talk about, which is a social pathology, is marital friction. So, like we've talked about all of these men who are coming home with all of these problems and stress and anxiety that they can't acknowledge, and they don't know why they're like this. And obviously, if they're going to bring that home, there's going to be predictably stress in families and in marriages. This emotional and psychological baggage that was picked up by these soldiers comes home with them. And the circumstances of civil war, and for Southern soldiers, loss, puts a significant strain on marriages and families as veterans attempted to reintegrate into civilian life. Marital friction then was predictable. And while some of these are certainly common to Southern and Northern soldiers and veterans, some of these are going to be unique or exacerbatory of Southern soldiers who have to deal with defeat, of course. And manhood really takes a hit, and that's the thread through a lot of these conditions. For one, while they were gone, the women had to step up and perform the duties that their husbands and fathers had done before they left, like important decision makers, their protectors, their providers, all male roles and responsibilities before the war. And so many white women exhibited autonomy and independence out of necessity for the first time in their lives. So naturally there was tension and resentment when the families were united, and in a sense there's a bit of a power struggle, right? So these women who had this autonomy were used to doing things, and now their husbands come back and are trying to tell them how to do it the right way. It's too close to home. I don't know about you. Although I'm just going to a conference in Gettysburg, not going off to war, but nonetheless. Many soldiers returned as amputees, as injured or chronically ill, making them more dependent on their womenfolk or unable to work. And of course, they were, devastated that they couldn't support their families. That was really integral to who they were as men. And of course, Southern soldiers exited the war on the losing side. They lost their slaves. They had to sign an oath of loyalty to the U.S. And I'm sure some of you have done some of this reading yourself, but in a lot of the sources, the diaries, the letters, men and women in the South do not want to sign an oath of loyalty to the United States, right? They have just spent 4 years fighting them. They are the enemy. They are the devil incarnate. And now we have to sign this oath. And for some of them, this became a psychological stress point for them. But if they wanted to return to normal life, if they wanted to vote, they had to do this. So they were really very distressed by this. All of this is denigrating and demeaning to them. And then, of course, there's, I think, a common problem for all wars, which is that there's a disconnect between the civilians, the family left at home, and the soldiers. The soldiers complain, Jim McPherson talks about this in For Cause and Comrades. The soldiers complain that, their wives don't understand them, and the family members don't understand why their spouses or their brothers are acting this way. So that also creates resentment and alienation. So there's lots of reasons then that Civil War families could be unstable and volatile, and sometimes even violent, as veterans sought to reassert control in their homes. And I have just two quick examples. And the first of this is Henry and Lizzie Einboom from Memphis. You might have guessed that Einboom was born in Germany. He served in a Tennessee artillery company. He was captured, for how long we don't know, escaped, then probably deserted. After the war, upon returning home, to his family, he drank heavily. He was unable to get and hold a job to support his family. His marriage was falling apart. In all the ways that mattered to a Southern man via Germany, he was failing. So he hit the road trying to find a job from Mobile to New Orleans, St. Louis, and then Nashville, where he got word his wife was divorcing him. Unable to deal with the disappointment and the failures in his life, he penned a letter to his wife that was published in the Nashville newspaper, I'm sure by design, in which he detailed his plans to drown himself in the Cumberland River. And since he was never heard from again, we have to assume that he followed through. Another example of marital discord following the Civil War comes to us from a record from an insane asylum inmate, Ambrose Gibson, from South Carolina, who served in the 14th South Carolina Infantry. That entry shows us that there was marital discord in his family. Now, it wasn't until 1876 when he manifested psychological stress severe enough to warrant institutionalization. Physicians observed that his mind was at times, quote, so far destroyed that he had no control over himself, that he had threatened suicide. He also posed a violent threat toward others, presumably his wife. Asylum workers, however, believed his insanity stemmed from factors not at all related to his military experience, blaming instead, quote, inconstancy in the part of his wife. Inconstancy is a 19th century term for infidelity or lack of faithfulness, and his separation from her. So as with drinking, medical practitioners, as soon as they saw marital discord, they identified that as the cause of the mental illness, not a symptom of the mental illness. So in conclusion, what do all these examples of emotional and psychological suffering tell us about the Civil War? And more importantly, why does it matter? First, and most obviously, we're bringing into full view the previously hidden history of Civil War soldiers and the impact of their war experience on their psychological well-being. It establishes facets of war trauma that predate the Vietnam War and even earlier 20th century wars. We've long known the Civil War wreaked extensive damage, left buildings, bodies, economies in ruins. And to that, we can now add minds. Second, it gets us to a closer accounting of the costs of the Civil War. Human costs are much more difficult to assess, but knowing that war trauma took a toll on Civil War soldiers gives us a clearer understanding of what we gained as well as what we lost. Finally, the study of Civil War and trauma opens up opportunities to dig deeper in related areas, especially its impact on civilians, women, children. There are some longitudinal studies now of the children of veterans to identify physiological as well as psychological problems, the enslaved and the formerly enslaved. Historians, for example, have recently taken up the effect of violence on the formerly enslaved in the post-war South. It also encourages us to explore not just those who suffered the most, which is who you'll find in my book, but those who didn't. Those who proved more resilient. This is one of the most perplexing questions about PTSD. What factors determine who resists serious psychological damage in war? Two soldiers side by side have the exact same experience in a battle, witnesses exact same things, survive, and one has severe PTSD and the other one doesn't. What explains that? That's a really interesting question. I'll leave that to another historian. This morning, as I was leaving my hotel, walking around for breakfast on the square, I guess it's the circle there in front of the Gettysburg Hotel, there is a monument, most of you probably have walked past it, to Company K of the 1st Pennsylvania Reserves out of Adams County. And I noted that, like with a lot of commemorations and monuments, there is an accounting. 17 died, 23 injured. And that's the way we measure the cost of war on humans. But what my work suggests and the work of others in the field suggests that that's a lowball number, right? That there's other ways in which men emerged from the Civil War who were affected, and that too took a toll. And so this gives us an added facet to understanding the costs and the toll of human sacrifice among Civil War soldiers. Thank you very much, and I'll take your questions.
All good questions. We got to send everyone to lunch. You want to know more? You got to buy the book. Dr.
Thank you.
Sommerville will be outside signing books.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.